Yeah, we're good to go.
Okay, thanks so much. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to C's conversation series for the monsoon semester called Drawing Worlds. And C Conversations is a part of C City, the school's outreach program, and it is supported by the Urban Center Mumbai. And the school was established in 2014, and we've been hosting these talks since the very beginning. And it becomes a means for us for, participating in cultural discourse in the city and beyond. And since 2020, the talks have been organized as a semester-long series. So you have two in each year, one in the monsoon semester, one in the winter semester. And they've been conceptualized and anchored by different teachers at the school, and they follow their research interests and their practices. So Drawing Worlds comes from the school's interest in looking at drawing and at drawing practices closely, since they engender a politics of being and of building, since they're rooted in ways of seeing. We've had 4 conversations so far. We started with Rohini Deyavashar, and then Afra Shafiq, Nora Woodke, and Shrimanti Saha. And for this 5th talk, I'm so glad to be in conversation with Sayan Skandarajah. Sayan, welcome. You have the somewhat dubious honor of being the only man on the list of speakers for this series, which definitely wasn't a calculated omission on our part. But I'd just like to introduce you. So Sayan is a lecturer in architecture at the University of Reading, specializing in drawing-led research and critical design processes. And alongside his role in leading design studio and modules of visual communication at Reading, his PhD research, which is funded by the LAHP, is at the Bartlett School of Architecture and feeds into his own reflective practice, which scrutinizes architectural design processes and sets out original pathways to considering acts of drawing, tracing, and cartographic projection as a means of speculative world building. He is also co-curator of the Cartographies of the Imagination project, and this is an ongoing exploration into map-making, drawing, and the mind's eye. Sayan holds an MH degree in architecture from the Bartlett School of Architecture and an MA in architectural design from the University of Edinburgh. Sayan, welcome. We're very glad to have you. I'll just ask you to have your talk and I'll sort of fade into the background and then come back in later, and then we can have a talk and then everyone can just jump in with any questions that they have. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just let me know how I'm doing for time. If I'm rambling on too long, please don't be afraid.
Sure.
Thank you for inviting me for this talk. I'm really excited to contribute to it. I just say, I just found out now that I'm the only man on the series, and I think that's quite an amazing thing that you've put together a really interesting series of talks engaging with really exciting subject material, and the fact that, without calculation, there's only one man on the panel is really, really good for kind of the conversations about drawing and representation, and the fact that it's a very there's lots of people and lots of voices in that conversation. So I'm glad to be part of that conversation. So I'll just begin. I do have a tendency of getting too excited about drawing and talking for a bit too long. So I'll try and be quite brief. I've described this talk as drawings as sites and sites of drawing. And essentially, I want to talk about how I consider drawing as both an act, but also a product. So it's kind of the process of drawing, but also that results in a drawing. And that will kind of talk about, I guess, a kind of an ongoing research project that I've been working on. I'll describe that in full later. But just to introduce who I am, I mean, thank you, Whoever, for reading out my bio. I mean, it's a kind of a description, I guess, of who I am. I'm an architect, a researcher, a drawer. I engage with teaching. I teach at the University of Reading and run a design studio, and specialize in modules of drawing and representation. And I think I'm doing my PhD. I'm finishing at the moment. I've been doing it for a very long time. It's been a part-time project. And I guess what I want to draw attention to is the methodology of my PhD, which is a design-led methodology. And what that means is that the original work that is producing knowledge, that is considered original work for the research that I'm doing, is drawing. And I wanted to talk a bit about what drawing can offer as a form of research. This is a bit more about how I worked, and I'm an architect and studied at in Edinburgh. But drawing research, this is drawings from Ray Lucas, who talks a lot about the role of drawing as a way of understanding and a kind of interpreting things. So that drawing is a form of knowledge building, because architects and designers use drawing not just to kind of represent what they see, but also to come up with ideas. So it's a form of unearthing information. And I want to talk about this distinction between drawing and representation. So representation is what you would consider traditional conventional drawing. So plans, sections, axonometrics of buildings, of designs, that you're representing a kind of a building or a design or a city or something. Representation represents what already exists, or a project or a proposal in its kind of completion. Whereas drawing, architectural drawing, is perhaps the bit before representation. It's the process of figuring out what the design is, or figuring out how a city works, or kind of working through something through sketches, iterations, traces. And I think the idea that these are not the same is a kind of core part of my research, that drawing is a form of knowledge production, because it is a transition from something that exists in our mind and then comes into reality when it comes out in the piece of paper or a computer screen. So drawing is a real translation from ideas into forms of convention. And I guess one of the references I always show is Carlos Scarpa's drawing as a form of thinking. So these aren't representations of a design, because you can see that there's multiple scales, multiple perspectives. It's a sequence of quick sketches looking at the same detail of a project, but from different perspectives. And you can see here that this is not representation, because it's not a fixed representation. There's using conventions of representation like plans and sections, axes, etc. But it's drawing because it's figuring out and is trying to understand and propose a form of detail. So architectural drawing is a unique locus of active thinking, itself a wellspring of ideas where design emerges from within the effort of drawing. So how does architecture arrive? It comes through thinking through drawing. That's the kind of the focus that I tend to bring in my work. Drawing is not only an aid to the imagination, but the locus of invention is within drawing. So these are kinds of, this is all quotes from Paul Emmons, who talks about how we imagine space and how we use drawing to kind of facilitate our imagination. And Jonathan Hill, who sadly passed away this year, a professor who engages with drawing research, talks about the idea of architecture and design, which is this Latin term disegno, as the ideas behind architecture. And architecture and design is not just the final product, but the kind of how architects come up with, think about, and interpret the built environment. So these kinds of references, Eisenman's house studies, where the drawing is just as much the tool of figuring out the design kind of idea as much as the final product, is kind of what I'm interested in. And looking at the way in which drawing produces knowledge. So this is Ray Lucas, again, I mentioned before, talks about the entirely new type of knowledge that would exist through drawing. So how would you research something traditional research? You have archival research, where you look at what's been written about something and you kind of draw conclusions from that. You have, I guess, site research, which you go and do tests on a site and you draw conclusions from that. You do interviews or questionnaires. Whereas drawing as a methodology produces an entirely different type of understandings of something than any of the other traditional methodologies. So you can see in his work, he uses a combination of mappings and drawings to talk about how his projects develop. And other people who do this are people such as my supervisor, Penelope Heralamidou, who talks about the the blossoming of design structure in the mind. So her design research is talking about the blossoming of ideas from the drawing. And another reference, Perry Culper, talks about slow drawings, where the ideas that happen within the process, the slow process of drawing, kind of become and practice a design rehearsal in their own right. And I talk about imaginal drawing as this idea of a bridge between the visible and the invisible. So how when we draw something, and I'll talk about this later when we talk about another project that I did, the cartographies of imagination. When we draw, we're creating new things that are kind of relate to the existing world or the kind of the built world, but also produces its own world in itself. And I think the kind of the title of the lecture series, Drawing Worlds, is a really apt title for how we create new versions of place through drawing. And that's why in the title of my thing, when I talk about drawings as sites, I see sites of place as being related to the ways in which drawing produces new things. So again, Pallasmaa, who's a reference that many of you may have come across for different reasons, talks about the hand, the embodied act of drawing, and says the pencil in the architect's hands is a bridge between the imagining mind and the image that appears on a sheet of paper. The image appears as if it were an automatic projection of the imagining mind, or perhaps it's the hand that really imagines. So I'm kind of throwing a lot of quotes at you right now, which is quite an intense way of starting a talk. But I think it was good to talk about what are my motivations in my work, and I'll talk about how all of these ideas of drawing research have come into my previous work. So this is not my current work, but these are my student projects, where the role of the project, the architectural proposal, very much existed within what drawing could tell me about space. So this is an existing building that I used this kind of layered sequential drawing style to understand and propose at the same time. These are other projects that I worked on in my previous work. And I talk, whether it's between hand-drawn, kind of intuitive drawing and more digital layered drawing, I've always been interested in what a drawing could do and tell me as a designer about the way I understand place, but also how it could provoke the imagination to kind of think of a space that is both kind of specifically architectural, but also talking about time, talking about other forms of inhabiting space. So just showing these examples of my drawings in my previous work, where I was interested in these ideas of layering, of time, of tracing, particularly, and how these kinds of ways of interpreting architecture can develop an architectural agenda, which is looking at the role of drawing, essentially. So these are some projects that use architectural conventions, such as the axonometric, which is a thing I'll kind of come back to, where I use the conventions of the axonometric, which are meant to be kind of timeless, to actually reveal and talk about time and process. So some of my previous research is always, I've talked about the axonometric just now, I've always looked at how conventions of drawing, such as the axonometric, have connotations of empowerment, because it's kind of this God's eye view over space. So in modernism, Yves Alain Bois says it shows things more nearly as they're known to the mind. It's quite an abstract way of representing space, because it's it's not rooted, whereas the perspective is what we see. The axonometric is a very unembodied viewpoint, almost as if we're floating above the space. But despite that, it has this kind of connotations of truth and precision, because of its ability to kind of be measurable, and its kind of relationship to the plan. So it's both kind of simultaneously abstract, but also very precise and very accurate. So I was quite interested in the relationship between abstraction but truth, and and how the axonometric as a drawing convention forces the viewer to imagine space from a certain type of perspective, where you're empowered through this idea of the God's eye view, but you're also you're distanced and disembodied from the place. And I think it's fed into my research now. So the first thing I want to talk about is drawings as sites. So understand the site of a drawing. And this project is a part of my PhD, essentially, which is looking at Rakuchu Rakugai paintings and looking at the role of parallel projection, which is another broader term for axonometric drawing, and how that provokes urban imagination in the painting of early modern Kyoto. So Rakuchu Rakugai, what is it? It's a style of painting or a genre of painting that emerged in the 16th century in Japan. And essentially, it represented the city of Kyoto. Now, this is a style of painting called Yamato-e painting, which is like the typical Japanese screen painting style, kind of watercolor on these kind of folding screens, in this case, that represented the city. And you can see here that the city of Kyoto is represented as a kind of collection of scenes, but also represented the city as a whole. So you can see that you're representing the distant parts of the urban kind of territory through this kind of similar to axonometric projection. I would say it's kind of like a cavalier perspective. But you can see that there's if I go back here, there's these conventions of representation that follow Western ideas of what they termed axonometric or isometric projection. But in its own Japanese context meant and was regarded as something quite distinct. And you can see it's not just one painting, it's a whole genre of painting. There's a series of paintings that represent the city in this way. And I got really interested in these paintings because they both kind of employ architectural languages of parallel projection, this kind of God's eye view from above, where the whole city is, viewable for one person. And I was thinking about who that person would be. It would be someone in the political elite, probably with power, who use these paintings as a form of empowerment, to be able to kind of view the lives of everyday people, something that maybe they didn't have as much connection with, as they unfold before them. So this idea of viewpoint and voyeurism that drawing affords almost kind of reveals a territorial kind of quality of painting in these cases. So and lots of different aspects of the city are revealed, but also the use of, you probably noticed already, gold cloud that kind of sprawls across the city as a kind of almost uniform kind of layer. Both represent something that's kind of tangible, like the actual clouds of Kyoto, but also is a device, a visual device, to jump from one place to another. So what does that mean? That means that there's not necessarily a cohesion between what's happening between one scene and another. So the cloud would represent typically a kind of physical distance that's covered. But if you go back to the main overall composition, the distances, the real life distances between these places are much further than are represented. So the cloud actually compresses the image of the city by moving from one scene to another, regardless of how far away they are in reality. So the paintings not only employ this type of drawing that have these kind of connotations of truth and precision and objectivity, but they also manipulate how we read the city. They make things look like they're closer together. They make things look like they're busier. They make things like famous sites and landmarks more cohesive than one drawing could possibly do, because they manipulate how we interpret and view the city. So essentially what I was interested in is, how do the artists use conventions of representation that tell us that have this believability to them, this objectivity to them, but use the representation in a way that manipulates and distorts our understanding of the actual city. So how does drawing have a role in manipulating what we imagine Kyoto to be like? This is just talking about how a person would actually engage. You can see here there's two screens. So there's a kind of generally westerly and easterly direction of this. So the idea is that you would sit in amongst these folding screens, and it will be like a panorama. You can watch and see the city from two perspectives. And the paintings are really detailed. They're not only architecturally not precise, but really fleshed out, but have thousands of figures individually painted that populate and inhabit these paintings. But I became interested in this idea of what the gold cloud was obscuring. And as I talked about before, what the idea of drawing as a site is, I'm interested in the version of Kyoto that this painting projects. So even though this painting shows us Kyoto and has recognizable parts of the city, it is also a version of Kyoto that's not true. It doesn't exactly exist like this. The proportions of the buildings are different. The relationships between sites have been compressed. Things are closer together. So it's a new version of Kyoto. It's a version of Kyoto that relates to the existing, but it's a new place that is being presented to us. And so I became interested in the site of Kyoto in this painting. This is an extract from a film by David Hockney, who talks about how conventions of representation were manipulated and toyed with in East Asian art. This is a Chinese scroll, and he was quite interested in the detail. You can see the kind of scales of the fish being painted in this scene, while still obeying this kind of axonometric kind of perspective, but also the manipulation of representation. So you see here one side of a bridge, this face, and as you meet the ground, you see the opposite face of the building, which if many of you may have been using axonometric drawing, it's like flipping the projective language. You shouldn't be able to see this face and this face, because this distance is kind of simultaneously on one side of the city and then simultaneously on the other. But David Hockney talks about how this painting gives us a kind of dynamic engagement with the scene where we're almost shifting perspectives and shifting viewpoints. It's not necessarily a mistake. It's an intentional device to move us in and around the city and give us and empower the view to see more of its urban spaces. So these paintings you can see across different genres have these different styles and aesthetics, but between them they all have a consistency of the gold cloud, the use of parallel projection, the use of creating this idea of place that was aspirational. You can see here Matthew McElway, who's written a lot about these paintings, present images that aspire to the capital state. So it's not a truthful reflection of Kyoto. It's an invented version of Kyoto that is both aspirational, because at the time the city had been destroyed by fires and civil war, but it was also nostalgic. It was like a nostalgic view of what Kyoto was. And it allowed the person viewing it to kind of have this ownership, this idea of territory. And this type of drawing and this type of painting was existing in Japanese painting before the genre. This is a kind of a extract of another scroll painting from Japan from many centuries before, and you can see that the conventions of parallel projection, this kind of axonometric viewpoint, was always used, but it was used in a way to tell stories. So you can see here physical parts of the city are also covered, but also showcasing here, I guess, the urban development of Kyoto. So you can see this new wall, this blurred the inside and the outside of the city. So the kind of the threshold of the inner parts of the city and the outer parts of the city, and the cloud being this kind of thing that joins both together. So what am I interested in? I'm interested in the role of architectural representation in these paintings because they've been studied, I guess, a lot by art historians who talk about what's been written about the paintings, what exists, and what we can determine by the paintings themselves. But from an architectural perspective, there is a missing link. Not much has been thought about in terms of its use of architectural convention, and drawing as a form of understanding the paintings, but also inhabiting the paintings, could tell us a lot more about the architectural distortion, manipulation, and curatorial devices of how the city has been manipulated by representation. That is kind of currently missing. So my frame of reference is these are some artists that use the kind of, I guess, the language of these paintings in their work. So this is Akira Yamaguchi, who does amazing drawings, but I guess misunderstands or misinterprets the use of the cloud, where it becomes a physical covering of the city. So there's no jumping from place to place. Here, it almost becomes like a decoration, a motif, rather than a kind of a device to move us from one perspective to the other. Other people that use this form of representation in their language are Drawing Architecture Studio and Team Lab, who again play with and distort the role of representation in their works. And I talk about my methodology, reflective design, the use of drawing and the use of sketching as a way of understanding the paintings is an original way of looking at them, but also in developing a series of design projects that use the spaces, the architectural spaces that the painting kind of implies, with something that hasn't really been done before. Because the painting has architectural convention, as in scale, proportion, and a kind of projective system, they become, I guess, almost like architectural drawings, proposals that can be interpreted and analyzed. So, for example, this is the Saigonji Temple, which is the name of this painting, the Saigonji screens. It's a real place that exists today in a different form. And you can see that the different versions of these paintings, so this is both in the 17th century, but this is the Saigonji screens and this is the Ikeda screens. You can see that there's some similarities between these two paintings. There's the Sanjisangendo temple, which is represented in both paintings, kind of almost in the same position as each other. And I'll talk a bit more about the Sanjisangendo temple later. And then you can see the Saigonji temple also represented in a similar kind of location on the painting. But you can see in this one, the painting, whilst the Sanjisangendo temple is roughly the same size, or kind of proportionally the same size, the Saigonji temple is much bigger in this painting. Now, what we know about axonometric drawing is that drawing convention keeps scale. Scale is consistent in an axonometric projection. So what that means is that the artists are manipulating the reality of Kyoto, or at least the reality of the building, or the representation of the building, to show how all of these things are within the artist's control in terms of manipulating how we actually inhabit and how we actually imagine these places. So the Saigonji temple, again, the Saigonji screens are a set kind of context of these buildings that, again, I chose to kind of look at and inhabit in more detail. I talk about the golden clouds as a device, but the device of golden clouds is not just a tool to move from one place to another. They're also a kind of, I guess, a passage of or a motif in East Asian art that represents time. It represents moving from one place to another and the dreamlike quality of time passing. So you can see here, it's not just about moving from a physical place to another place, it's also about moving from one time to another. And this refers back to kind of Western art, which talks about the cloud space, the gold clouds, as a dream space, as an imagined space. And I guess I'm quite interested in the idea of the gold cloud representing not just a device or a physical representation of a cloud, but representing our imagination, representing this kind of unspoken, undetermined thought space that is indicative of dreaming, of time passing, and the imagination, the celestial imagination. So what I wanted to do is use this whole premise, this idea of drawing convention, the idea of parallel projection being a consistent drawing language that kind of goes through infinity. There's no kind of edge of an axonometric drawing. It kind of continues forever. But then also the idea of the cloud as a imagined space, a mental kind of space of thought and imagination, to inquire on or kind of develop a way of drawing that interpreted the painting as a space that's incomplete. And what that means is, like, if I treat the drawing as a site, as a place, I can use the conventions of representation, which allow angles of projection to continue, to speculate on what's behind the cloud. And that led to the series of drawing called Scenes of Another Kyoto, which you can see here. I've inverted the original painting. The original painting here in color is now this kind of gold line drawing. And the black represents my invented space that continues and inhabits the painting's cloud as if it were a real space, and follows the conventions of drawing that the painting triggered to create a new landscape, essentially. So to kind of break that down, this is the original painting. I then analyzed the painting and continued lines of projection, essentially. So I kind of followed the existing lines of projection to imagine, well, if it is a parallel projection, these kind of buildings would continue in that perspective. This railing would continue in that way. This fence would kind of... There's enough in the painting that you have information about this architectural implied space. And then using my own inventive language, inhabit that kind of framework to complete and fill in the gaps between these spaces, whilst also creating and developing the language myself. So I guess this is a kind of a breakdown of the original painting, and then the kind of the lines of projection that I follow, and then the new drawing that I inhabit through tracing and through speculation and through populating with characters and figures. That becomes a space that is related to the original painting, that is almost independently, entirely separate from it. It becomes a new space. It becomes an imagined space. It exists within the territory of the painting, but is also fundamentally separate from it. There's no overlap. There's a kind of... it's essentially inhabiting the void. So I'm interested in these moments where you can see here these parts of the architecture is completed as you would expect it to, or more or less expect it to. But then there's other parts of the painting that become its own new thing in and of itself, where nothing is defined by the surroundings, that gives license for new things to emerge, for new details. And the idea of the motif of the architecture, the language of the buildings, becomes a part of how the architecture is completed, but then also how the spaces and the in-between ideas are then fragmented and distorted. So you can see they become more abstract further afield, where there's less information and spaces and speculations start to occur. So this is both a kind of an analysis of the painting, but it's also a speculation. It's a new thing. It's a piece of design. It's using drawing to understand the conventions of representation in the painting, but it also uses the manipulation that the artist originally used to tell a new story. And this is quite common in the Japanese paintings itself. There's a genre called fukinuki yatai, which means blown off roof, which essentially means it's essentially the exploded axo that you might obviously be using in your own drawings, where the roof is removed from representation, kind of even though it's not technically removed, it's removed for our own voyeurship, to be able to peer into the scenes behind the roof, to show us the internal scenes. And we do that in expedited drawings. We take the buildings apart, we remove parts of the facade to see what's behind. And that essentially is a motif that I'm kind of doing in twofold. I'm doing it not only of the clouds themselves, like removing the cloud, but also within that, kind of poking into certain spaces and places that are behind or underneath the roof itself. And the other reference is there, Lissitzky's Crown, which I talked about just very momentarily when I introduced the notion of abstracted manipulations of axonometric drawing, where because axonometric drawing was this abstract form of understanding space, because it was not rooted in reality, there were ideas of infinity, idea of weightlessness, ideas of abstraction and irrationality that the artists in the 20th century started to celebrate. And you can see that the Japanese were doing this many centuries earlier in their manipulation and toying with roles and conventions of drawing. So these scenes, I guess, they represented, I guess, an urge to see what's behind the cloud, but also in doing so revealed that it was kind of pointless, because the clouds, as I mentioned, don't represent physical covering of the city. They represent a transition, a moment of dream. And by, drawing in the space, I kind of almost ruined the dream. I kind of introduced my own fixed, coherent logic thing that completes the city image, but also becomes an irrational and incomplete image in of itself. Now, I talked about Hockney's irrational bridge convention, and this happens in the painting. The painting obscures these moments where two different forms of projection conflict or overlap. But you can see here, these moments come up in the cloud, where the cloud would previously kind of break the gap of these two clashing perspectives. By drawing in that space, inhabit those moments as kind of awkward moments that clash with each other, but also in themselves do what Hockney says, which is a marvelous, complex example of shifting viewpoints that seem to make perfectly ordered sense to me. So the idea that conflicted viewpoints is a negative thing is obviously something that I refute and agree with Hockney, in the sense that embodying a viewpoint where you can see things from multiple perspectives, even if they don't necessarily make sense from a convention way, allows us to kind of to have this relationship to the scene that is more dynamic. And you can see here that the clouds, become this kind of landscape of irrational but also ordered space that kind of build up new compositions and relationships to the original scene, which is now this kind of faint gold line work. So that was the scenes of another Kyoto, and this is a long drawing. It took a long time to do, because it obviously involved a simultaneous analysis, but also hand-drawn kind of intervention. And what I became interested in is, if I took the idea of treating the drawing as a site, as a place, and also treating the use of convention in the drawing, as in parallel projection, as architectural information, you could go one further in this and treat the painting as an architectural proposal. And so what this means is the next project I did, which is called Under the Surface of the Ikeda Screens, looks at a different set of paintings. They're not the Saiganji screens, but the Ikeda screens. And what I did was I used the dimensional information that you can, and analyze in the painting through the proportions, the dimensions, the scale, and you can reconstruct the painting as a 3D model. So whereas the previous exercise was looking at the hand and then inhabiting the space of the painting, I used the digital tracing to understand proportion and depth as represented by the painting, to rebuild the painting as a physical thing. So basically, it's essentially treating the painting as an architectural drawing with scale and dimension, which again is something that artists don't traditionally tend to do, or are historians. And what this meant was that I kind of interpreted how the implied spaces of the painting, how a painting implies space and depth, and what that actually means when you start to reconstruct it and rebuild it. And it also played with the idea of like this as a literal rebuilding of the painting becomes a vertical landscape, because the conventions of the painting portray depth as in distance through positioning on a vertical screen. So things that are meant to be further away are just positioned higher up in the composition. That even though that's meant to be a flat ground, there's just a vertical composition. But obviously, if you're reconstructing the painting, you don't create that distance, that implied distance. You're essentially treating it as an extrusion of a surface. And then this here, the represented ground plane, like the ground of the original painting, and then the represented cloud plane. So this idea of reconstructing the painting became this idea of depth and implied space, of things being behind or in front. And I think that there was a hierarchy between the built space, the cloud space, and the ground space. So these are just some kind of work in progress stills of understanding the implied depth of these paintings, this idea of a shift from the ground to the sky, and the architectural inhabitation of it. So what I was quite interested in is reusing this reconstruction to create alternative drawings of the painting, or looking and understanding the drawing as a place, but drawing it from a different perspective. So the 3D model allowed me to do another axonometric drawing, another isometric representation of the city, but from a different perspective. You can see here, but treating the landscape as a vertical one, where all of these characters are exactly where they should be. These are reconstructed figures that inhabit the scene in the exact same position as the original painting. But as you start to treat the painting as an implied physical space, the three-dimensional nature of this axo plays with ideas of depth, of what's in front and what's in behind, or what's kind of empty because of the nature of projection and the idea of plane, and what's revealed and what's concealed. So this drawing here of unsurfacing Kyoto tried to investigate the layered nature of the painting, and how the implication of depth in the painting was something that we couldn't necessarily take for granted. These are just another detail looking further up, redrawing, I guess, the painting and making almost kind of doing a cover version of the city, but using the exact same framework, the exact same information of the original painting. It becomes something different, becomes something new. And this is an earlier version of the drawing that was represented in an exhibition. And I was also interested in using the 3D model for other purposes. I actually did some 3D prints. I've actually got one right here. If you can see my computer screen, that's a 3D print of, and that's one-to-one from the painting of of my 3D model. But I was interested in using the 3D model in other ways. I was interested in, the idea of inhabiting the painting in perspective. So these are some drawings, series drawings called Inside the Surface, where I shift from the kind of, I guess, the isometric perspective to the perspective, kind of the actual 2 or 3 point perspective, where you are entering the painting. And that's the idea that if you rebuild the painting, you can inhabit the painting from a new perspective by being inside it. You can see here, this is one where you're on the side of it, so revealing this like vertical landscape. This is another kind of close-up of being kind of having a more eye-level view of painting, but seeing the space. Because the ground is like a backdrop, the these elements of the city are essentially just floating in a digital landscape. And these hand drawings of a digital model are about, again, using the act of drawing to inhabit and understand and also reveal new things about the space of the painting. And this is actually a drawing, this is a photograph of it being hung, but it's actually behind the painting. So looking from the ground towards the sky. So you can see the ground here is this more kind of darker gold, and the cloud is the lighter one. So we're directly behind the ground looking towards the sky, which is obviously like a reverse perspective of the digital painting. So these two studies were looking at the site of drawings as a site, drawings as a place, and inhabiting the places, the implied places of the original paintings, to understand that when we see a drawing, it's provoking an imagination of place. But there's also sites of drawing. So what are the actual intended locations? What are the kind of real life consequences of the place that is being imagined? And how does drawing become a site in of itself? So this next study is a quick study, but it's looking at the actual real life representation of the Sayan Skandarajah temple, which I referred to earlier in the talk. And you can see here that these are different representations of the same building in different paintings. This is the Sayan Skandarajah temple, which is where these archery competition would take in the past. And by going to the actual real life temple, and actually this is the same building as it would have been in the 16th century, so it hasn't changed at all, hasn't been destroyed or rebuilt. And doing my own kind of drawing and analysis, I thread together these multiple representations of this single building that has been kind of undergone several different drawings. This is the interior of the building, which is full of these amazing statues, to weave together this kind of composite narrative of place. So the same building, but represented both through my own observations in plan and elevation, but also these paintings that represent the same building, but from different scales, perspectives, and languages. And that led to this project here, which is this Inside Outside Kyoto project, which relied on my own engagement with Kyoto as a place. So like my field visits to Kyoto, I'm producing these digital scans using photogrammetry, which is a form of like 3D scanning of the city. These are some kind of examples of fragments of the city that I kind of scanned. And what it does is it means that you trace this kind of the existing building with these photographs, and the photogrammetry reconstructs that as a digital model, kind of a dense cloud view. And I was quite interested in like using the idea of the representation of place as also a site in itself, so to be inhabited and drawn upon. So these are kind of 3D scans of fragments of Kyoto that I then inhabit through CAD drawing to, you know, it's essentially as an interloper to interrogate and interrupt the scenes of these paintings. So this was a sketch for this idea of a composite where fragments and collections and moments would come together in a similar version of the Rakuchu Rakugai painting, where the idea of a whole would be connected through these fragments of scenes without a cloud, but still through these kind of fragmented scenes, and resulted in this project Inside Outside Kyoto, which was relying on my actual inhabitation of Kyoto, my embodied scanning of real life places, but then the digital reconstruction and the digital compilation of these things and fragmentation of elements to create an urban landscape that represented kind of almost a dreamlike memory of my engagement with Kyoto as a place. And you can see, obviously, with the scan, with the digital model, you can recreate this idea of the axonometric perspective. But also, it's interesting that you can get an axonometric perspective from something that requires your in-person perspectival photographs. So even though I didn't scan anything from an axonometric perspective, it produces this as a language, which are then, similar to the previous slides, inhabited further as a landscape to draw and extend and interrupt, to create this seamless composition of something that is factually objective, kind of these digital 3D models of the real life Kyoto, but then also speculative in how they come together and then are weaved together through my drawing. And that goes from like CAD drawing, digital drawing, but also from hand tracing and hand embellishment of these things using Lightbox. So I'm just going to end on, again, on the theme of science of drawing. We're just talking a bit about cartography of imagination, which is this project that I ran with my friend Kirsty Badenoch a couple of years, 3 years ago. And it was an exhibition forum, and we had a book, lots of different things came out of it. And it was housed in Ombed Gardens in London, which is a series of greenhouses. And also a book came out of that as well, which had lots of different themes. And the idea is that the project Cartography of the Imagination is about looking at ways of representation of representing things that we imagine. You can see the connection to my research here. We, in the book and in the forum, we had lots of different contributors such as Paul Colling, Francesco Benedetto, and Saskia Oldevolbers, who all look at map mapping and drawing place, but places of imagination that are kind of not quite true or not quite accurate, but also relating to some other form or other moment of recording place. This is a piece by Ashley Carroll. So it formed part of this exhibition and forum of events and discussions that talked about how drawing can provoke the imagination and be informed by the imagination. This is some of the events that took place. It included, it's quite a beautiful kind of garden as well. So we had these external outside installations and poetry recitals that were all related to how we imagine place. And the reason why I wanted to end on this is talk about this series of drawing workshops that I conducted with students. So these are some students that did this drawing workshop, which was about using a combination of actual drawings as sites. So these are some examples of drawings from Drawing Matter, which is an archive of drawings that provided us with these original drawings that we reflected on and inhabited as as places, but then also the site of drawing. So the actual being outside and being in the gardens in the kind of greenhouse space as a way of reflecting on context and place. So you can see here that we did these collaborative drawings where we had teams of 5 working on this 1.5 by 1.5 meter space, where essentially the individuals contributed to a language and built on each other's reflections, both on the place, but also these original drawings that we gave them as triggers, as starting points. So this idea of layering, collective drawing, intuition, and process, to really reflect on what the theme of my talk was, which is this idea of a drawing is a place of itself, but is also a place in which you draw and you discover something. Whether it's a moment of reflection, or it's a moment of note-taking, or kind of pathfinding, using conventions of drawing and distorting those to kind of create and reflect new things. So you can see these are 3 different drawings that came out of this workshop from students that had the same starting point. They all had the same site and they also had the same starting drawings, but the languages they developed are so different and so unique to each other. That I think they became quite successful, and we exhibited them in its own right. So yeah, that's the I think that's the end of my slideshow. Thank you so much for entertaining my my interest in drawing and drawing place, and hopefully you got something out of that. And I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sayan. As I mentioned to you before, also, we've been thinking through this anchor that's there from the little bits of work that we've been able to see online on, the imaginal properties of drawing, or, traversing the real and imagined in the telling of space, actually, and then, what gets folded into the map, and also of, the drawing as the site is something that we want to articulate as well. How it becomes your first encounter with the build. And actually, a couple of years ago, we had invited Niall Hobhouse of Drawing Matter also. So he took part in
Oh,
a
great.
conference with the school. And that was nice to have him. And I know that, you work closely with him in the Cartographies of Imagination project as well. But, thank you so much for sharing your work here. And I just wanted to talk about, like when you showed me the when you showed all of us that first drawing of Kyoto, what I was reminded actually of, Louise Brettes's map of Paris from 1739,
Mm.
and how, even though the drawings are structured in a similar way, where it's neither an axonometric nor an isometric, it's somewhere in between it, where you're sort of tilting the plane of the ground in order that you have this bird's eye view that lets you simultaneously float over the entirety of the city at the same time. And then how he took almost 3 years, with the permission of the mayor of Paris at that time, to document the facades of all of those buildings. And then the entire map gets printed on these 20 copper plates. So it's this vast enterprise that is several years in the making. And even though it's setting up a similar way or a similar position of seeing space, it's completely different, because in the drawing of Kyoto, you're already talking about um, the little things. You have the temple, and then you have the practices that get opened up around the temple, and you have the clouds that are coming and obscuring, and then that itself is setting up a way of seeing. Whereas in the drawing of Paris, you have this each and every facade that is incredibly detailed, and then just presented so that you see all of the streets, and it's actually coming from, ways of seeing the world. And I know that you, in one of the slides, you were looking at Massimo Scolari's work as well, and he has this book on the history of anti-perspective, and he's talking about how there's this excerpt that I remember actually, where he talks about how at one point, when you have you have these Jesuit priests who are going to China and trying to bring Christianity to the Chinese over there. A part of why they failed is because, they assumed that the Renaissance perspective is universally relevant. But the Chinese couldn't read them, okay, because they're accustomed only to parallel projections, and their drawings are focusing on landscape and flora and fauna, and not on, the way in which rectilinear form is getting constructed in perspective painting. And also, it's because of, the philosophical purpose of the image itself, where it's not about reproducing the appearance of an object, but rather to, understand the intellect of the image itself. And in a
Mm.
sense, that is what drawings, and especially when you're speaking about drawings at a particular point in time, which are setting up the idea of the city or of the world, that they're trying to do. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about, how this particular mode of drawing sets up a way of, translating the world, like what is the reflection of the world for them. And I know that you spoke across the coordinates of, nostalgia and aspiration, and then how there's also the dream space of the drawing. But is there any kind of underpinning of how the world gets constructed through this particular form of drawing that is
Mm.
present in these?
Yeah, so essentially, I think, yeah, there's some really interesting points you made there. Thank you. It's a real difference in the approach to representation in the East and in China and Japan, but not just China and Japan, but you can find these conventions of representation in a lot of non-Western forms of representation. So similar to Persian miniature painting and also Indian Mughal painting, these forms of non-linear, non-perspectival representation as being not intended to be accurate depictions of architectural space, but ideas of communication, so storytelling. And it becomes a kind of, I guess it's the Western obsession with having power over their built surroundings. So they have to have control. They have to have this idea that we can come up with this coherent system that can be repeatable, that has this idea of a really controlled and empowered form of recording and denoting space and built environments around them. So not just the interpretation of axonometric drawing, which is about precision, accuracy, objectivity, and this idea of rationality that came around in the Renaissance, when the Renaissance and the Enlightenment was all about rationality, so things that could be proven, essentially. And that came about not just about for the axonometric and parallel projection, but also for perspective. The idea of the perspective was kind of a precise tool for recording in an accurate way, or kind of a consistent way at least, our experience, which is quite, obviously subjective. And the perspective isn't true. Like a perspective isn't actually a recording of what we actually experience, because our eye doesn't fix in one moment. It darts around, it zooms in, it focuses on different things. We don't ever experience the thing in perspective, but it's meant to provoke the idea of being there. So in these forms of representation, it's not meant to really evoke the form of being there. It's meant to provoke this idea of just a completely different relationship to space. The eye in the sky, the kind of third eye looking down on the scene, is not meant to be the godlike figure that it is in the West. Instead, it's meant to kind of facilitate the idea of storytelling, so that you are seeing the stories unfold. You're understanding space unfold before your eyes, because something interesting and something a narrative is taking place, time is taking place, people are moving from one place to another. You don't really see these drawings that are devoid of people, and that's kind of the point. Like, they're not just buildings; they are inhabited spaces, and therefore the representation of the buildings are not meant to be accurate. So part of the reason I drew the painting of Sanjay Temple several times is that all the versions of that building were slightly different. They had slightly longer facades, they had slightly different heights. But it doesn't matter, because we recognize it. And it's the idea that we recognize place more easily than we think. And that comes down to identity. So what do we think of when we think of Paris? We think of certain places. We have this idea, we recognize the geometric arrangement of the streets. And these things actually summarize place more quickly than geometric precision or kind of ideas of objectivity. So it comes back to identity. And one of the things about these paintings, and try and skip a few slides back, they actually weren't composed, unlike the Paris example that you talked about, where an actual survey like this survey, where I went actually into the city and documented its facades. These paintings weren't produced in that way. Instead, they were, going back to the idea of drawings as sites, they were inspired by earlier paintings. So I'm just going back to the original views of the paintings. These 17th century paintings, especially of famous landmarks, you can see that they relate to other parts of the painting. So what would have happened is that the artist would have looked at the compositions and arrangements of earlier paintings and copied or kind of related back to those paintings, not just in these paintings, but also in smaller paintings like fan paintings, or a smaller kind of scale things where famous scenes or locations or landmarks of Kyoto were represented. And almost like a kind of homage to those paintings, reproduce but then recontextualize them within their own compositions. So the idea of representation of place was almost using other sites, other paintings as sites, and representing those versions of place rather than the actual real Kyoto, because people were more familiar, especially people outside of Kyoto. Because remember, these paintings weren't produced for people of Kyoto to look at. They were produced for people outside of Kyoto to imagine Kyoto. People were more familiar with how a certain place was represented in a painting than any personal experience of that place. So it all comes down to how do we summarize, or how do we put identity on place through imagery, essentially. And for Japan and East Asia at the time, objectivity and using kind of conventions of drawing was not important because architecture didn't come from that way. The way that buildings were built in this time was through an understanding of craft and hierarchy and like general proportion. So the timber workers would understand how to build architecture. They did not produce plans and sections in the same way that Western architects at the time would have done. So drawing didn't have this status of being needing to be precise in a geometric perspective. Drawing was more fluid in these paintings to be kind of indicative touchstones for memory and nostalgia than it did for being a kind of a tool or instrument to build. And that's the fundamental difference.
Right. I just want to extend that a little bit, and you speak of narrative traditions and drawing forms. And of course, over here in the Indian subcontinent as well, you have a lot of indigenous drawing practices that are narrative. And of course, because they're much more visible, you have the miniature drawings of the Mughals, of the Persians. And like you said, they have these multiple perspectives of showing space that use a logic which is not the geometrical logic that the one point or the many pointed perspective sets up. But it does work with the idea that if you were to move from in space from one point to another, your perception or your relationships between these objects would necessarily change. But to extend that, that there is a like this dialogue between the way in which spaces are getting built and the forms of drawing that they are engendering. So if you have a narrative drawing, very often it's talking about the continuity of space, or it's talking about a simultaneity of space and time. It's looking at the provision for intimacies of autonomous practices within it. Or in the miniature drawings themselves, where you look at how the idea of time itself is cyclical and it loops into it, and also that there is because the paintings themselves come together as a aggregate. You have a layering that puts them together, where you have the space and you have objects and then you have people and then all these various relational logics that are putting together the space of the painting, that is also extended into how spaces actually go on to get built. So you have the idea of a complex or this group of buildings that have certain relationships to each other, which may not always be easy to describe in a drawing like the plan, because you have all these projections of courtyards at various levels or overlapping balconies, things like that. And that drawing, it's both, it's dialogical. The drawing is building this process of seeing space, and that seeing space is also giving into the drawing. So I was wondering if you felt that there was any correlation between how these drawings set up practices of built space or of space making or of understanding it. And also, your drawing is setting out to complicate and inhabit the nature of the city that the screens are setting up. And the screens possibly have like a hierarchy of space and habitation. So like you spoke about the temple, which might be at the center or which might be at the larger, and then there's this whole play with space and proportion that they're doing. So what is the spatial proposition actually that gets made about how the built environment comes together?
Well, I think I guess the first part of your question, which is the relationship between drawing and building, and I think that definitely is true. I mean, my first dissertation, which looked at the themes of representation in architecture, talked about how in the 20th century, when the Western interpretation of the axonometric loosened, so in the 20th century, when the Lissitzky paintings came about, but then also de Stijl, I think let's go back to that slide. When they started using the axonometric in a as a tool to not just to kind of explore precise space or kind of objective space, but they actually understood the idea of the axonometric represented an idea of a weightlessness and the idea of not being bound. And that is almost a summary of modernist architecture in the West, where they were obsessed with floating architecture or seamless architecture, that kind of sliding walls, corner windows, architecture that almost seemed impossible, right? This idea of floating, Corbusier's kind of pilotis, like lifting up the first level and creating this like weightlessness of architecture. And that was, I think, combined with this fascination with drawing architecture in the axonometric, which the ground was disappeared. You know, the idea of the space was possible because you could, the intersecting planes, and that triggered the Distill movement. It triggered a lot of how modernist architecture developed. And you can make huge comparisons between the themes and elements of modernist architecture to traditional Japanese architecture. Traditional Japanese architecture had sliding screens for many, many centuries. Traditional Japanese architecture had no fixed partitions in walls. They didn't have any, and this is probably down also to the kind of use of material that they use, but also, for me, it kind of makes sense that they were representing architecture in parallel projection for many centuries, and their architecture was seamless, unbound, and weightless. And as soon as the West rediscovered that potential of drawing, the architectural language also shifted to become seamless, unbound, and that was a connection that I've made in terms of the relationship between how we imagine architecture through drawing, and how we build and construct, what type of architecture we build and construct. So yeah, I think there is a real strong relationship between that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just meant that I feel like that sort of answered the second part of the question also. But I just wanted to ask, because over here you're drawing on a drawing, and it's a revisiting of a terrain that happens. And, it's an excavation, quite literally, because you're trying to dig and work with what is beneath the clouds. But it's also this very distinctively about adding to. And, you have obviously Perry Culper, who talks about, drawing as a generative realm, and which is not descriptive or a technique motivated position. I just wanted to ask, because it's an incremental process that you spend a lot of time with, and it's this continuous building of this site, what shifts with each visit with this form of engagement? Are you able to, are there narratives that you are generating yourselves, or certain relationships that you are setting up? And does it enter the realm of like how invested do you get in the fiction of this terrain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite. I think the time of drawing is the other thing, isn't it? The drawing doesn't happen instantaneously. You might have an intention at the start, but you don't have a. So I think this is the first part. This drawing probably took about. I mean, it's really hard to say because it was different moments in time and different levels of intensity, but it took a long time. And I think I started with this panel here, this section of the drawing here, and slowly kind of worked my way through the scenes and kind of ended right at the top here. And I think the journey through the painting, you realize that you engage with the painting in a fundamentally unique way. So many people have looked at this painting. Many art historians, many professors, and they've analyzed it to a really sophisticated level of depth. But no one has done the painstaking form of drawing and inhabiting the space of the painting that I've done, which is it forces you to engage with that painting in just a different way, which means that you're reading different things, you're learning different things, you're seeing the drawing from a different perspective. I think that was one of the intentions. Even though the drawing is a result and a product in itself, the things that I learned through moving and inhabiting through the painting at a one-to-one scale. So this is obviously like, sort of digital version of the painting, but the physical drawing was a sequence of smaller drawings that were drawn at one-to-one. Drawing at one-to-one and inhabiting the painting at that scale forces you to learn the painting or learn new things about the painting that other people might notice, but as a sequence, as a form of engagement with the painting, doesn't happen in an instantaneous way. So the architectural, I guess the style of my drawing develops, the kind of what I am interested in, what I draw attention to. There's obviously a lot of the painting that is kind of empty, that you have to come up with something to inhabit that space, because there's, you know, some of these moments here, they're really easy to inhabit because you just continue this idea of this shot parade. But then there's other moments that are more have less to go on, essentially, and you have to be more inventive. And what you're using instead is the motif of what's happening, with, like, further. You know, for example, this one here, this is a tower, a pagoda, which I kind of add more pagoda, more levels than probably would have had, but becomes this kind of this descent into a more rural kind of natural landscape. So I think the idea of continuing the painting is as a precise way of doing it, but also kind of introducing your own language. It became a kind of a new way of engaging with what was happening, and developing a relationship to the existing that started to change how I was looking at the genre of painting as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just wanted to ask you, because the screens are so specific in their dimensions and in the fact that they're these large things that you read almost by walking along them. So it's essentially this, that it's about the act of reading. So essentially, that if the drawing is an entity and if it has its own form, which is not inert and indifferent to the viewer, how do you set up a reading, or how does the drawing for you unfurl and happen? And this was interesting because we've been thinking about the reading as part of the form of the drawing itself. So whether it's on a wall and you're reading it by walking its length, or in Chinese scrolls where it happens in this linear way where you're seeing it a few feet at a time, or even if it's a speculative drawing that is made as a pamphlet or a brochure where they harness the attitude of DIY and the reading of what might otherwise be an axonometric that you just see as in the convention of building. So this is because on the website where your article is there on drawing matter, it's almost prefaced by you start off with a video, and that video is you're floating over the drawing and the camera is guiding you through the landscape, whereas the way in which you engage with the drawing of the screen itself, like the drawing of Kyoto, would be something very different. So
Yeah.
what is it like? What is the reading that you want to set up?
No, that's a really good question. This is something I've been grappling with, because when I started this drawing, I was working remotely, so I had a really good resolution scan of the painting, but I hadn't visited the painting yet. So I visited Japan after producing this drawing, and then I actually experienced the one-to-one reading of the physical entity for the first time after having undertaken this process, which kind of I guess reflected my subsequent pieces that deal with that. But the reading of the format of painting, so this folding screen, is quite unique, and it can't really be replicated on a screen. Even if you print out all of the things and recreate it, it's still a fundamentally specific thing. So it's not a flat surface, because obviously it's an undulating screen. It's also, there's two of them. So I think the representations that I've shown you of two screen paintings, you can see here, these are some of the how these screens relate, but how they were positioned and how the body sits with them. So is it sat, is it standing, are they side by side, or are they kind of more how I represented it, where you're in the middle? These are the two screens, but how we engage with that I think you create the idea of it creating a physical space that someone inhabits is more closer to how they were meant to be read, because you're meant to feel this idea of immersion, right? This idea of the panorama. And the problem with our screens on our computer, even when I'm showing you now on your computer screens, you're confined to this crop, this frame, and this distance that you're given. And even if you look at it one-to-one on a screen, you're denying yourself the experience of what's not on the screen, essentially, because you have to pan between them.
Yeah.
And so it gives you things that way of looking at a painting gives you something that is quite unique, but also removes you from the idea of being immersed in that kind of experience. So it was quite interesting to do the drawing without having had that experience, the anticipation of what that experience is, and then to go to Japan, which I did the following year after this drawing, and experience the sensation of being there in the physical. I talk about the drawing as a place, so it's quite funny to actually go to the place of the drawing and experience that as a sensation itself. But the idea of how we read these screens is interesting. There's so many things in how we are taught to read things. We're taught to know that this is further back than this, or because it's higher up in the painting. And that's true of most parallel projection, but there's no real reason why. There's no convention that these two things are represented at exactly the same scale, but we kind of know that this is further back because it's just positioned in a different part of the screen. And so the conventions of drawing and the conventions of representation within the format, the folding screens, lead us to imagine the space in a specific way, but are reliant on these kind of rules that we kind of place upon it. Even the fact that this part of the pagoda is not pagoda, the float, which is from the Gion Festival, is kind of going in front of this cloud, represents that it must be super tall because it's kind of poking above the clouds. So yeah, I think I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think the format of the paintings is so unique. You talk about the scrolls and how we unfurl a story in a linear narrative at the pace of the reader because we're moving from one part to another. The difference between that and this is that there is no single focus point in this painting. So our eye is kind of overwhelmed with various different things at different positions and different parts, and just the sheer scale of it. There's no specific focal point. Now, the way that these artists make this building bigger, they use the scale of this actual temple, and they increase it for this, shows us that they wanted us to be focused on that building, because it is not. I've been there to this temple. It's a very, very small temple. So it's not as significant in the city as this painting would have you believe. But it creates focal points in a form of representation that has none, because of the positioning, the curatorial composition, and its scale. It gives a focal point to the painting, even though in an axonometric, it's everything is theoretically treated equally. But
yeah,
also,
no, it's like I think that's what the narrative itself is setting up, and it just reminded me of like when you read Calvino's Invisible Cities, and then there's the story of Esmeralda, where they say that the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line, but it's a zigzag, and then that is essentially how you might traverse the space of a narrative drawing as well. And I was wondering whether you had any idea for how your intervention would be set up, of whether it's a screen or how do you want it to unfold. But I think we'll I just like to invite, before anyone else. Oh, she'll have to. Okay, I don't know if Nora's here. Is Nora here? Joel?
Yeah, she's here. Purva.
Oh, Nora, I'd like to just invite Nora to come because she has a question, and she was our speaker at the last to last Sea Conversations event.
oh, great.
So Nora, if you'd like to unmute and just hi.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Sorry. I might be derailing the discussion slightly, but as a fellow academic, working with kind of like, I don't know, the pressures of publications around us and writing a PhD and all of that, you spoke a lot about narrative and storytelling and note taking. and also kind of like points of view and combining points of view. I was wondering how you see this relating to writing and to text, or if you do see any relationships between drawings and text in your work specifically. Like, I think in architectural drawing, there is like a very fluid relationship between text and the drawing itself. We rarely have when we talk about representation. But I was curious what you think about it in this particular work where drawing is kind of an epistemological project.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, text actually inhabits these paintings quite a lot. You can't see at the scale. I don't know if I've got a close up, but there are these titles. None of my close up seems to have it, but they are constantly at all these landmarks. You can see it here. These descriptions of the famous landmarks and kind of almost like labels of what is being represented here, and so it becomes a kind of layer of the representation of the place. It kind of takes us out of what the implied space is, but also kind of communication to the viewer what is being represented. So it becomes a physical layer that's almost separate from the painting, but also embodied and intertwined with it. And in terms of my own writing, there is a part of my PhD which is kind of being finished at the moment, being completed at the moment, which is on. So I've got 3 chapters in my PhD. They're quite big chapters, but they broadly deal with the themes of scene. And then projection, which is a very obvious title, and then the third one is place. And the place chapter, which includes the scans of Kyoto, my actual embodied visit to Japan and Kyoto, and my own response to place, the implied space of these paintings, includes a I guess an autoethnographic diary of fragmented ideas of place. So I use writing in that not as a form of just an analysis or kind of a narration of a description or a process, but as a sequence of single sentence observations of place. So fragments, and in a similar way that these are kind of fragmented views of a city, and they're layered because I've had the simultaneous privilege but also unfortunate situation of doing this PhD for 8 years, which means I've been to Japan 3 times, and each time I've been, it was different. Obviously, my relationship to the place was different, but also it spanned from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, and so my observations of how Kyoto exists as a place for a visitor or a foreigner, like I am, shifted in that time. And so that chapter, which I guess is really hard to present in a talk format, is a kind of layered and sequential description of my observations of Kyoto, or specific parts of Kyoto, through time. So my first kind of more naive observations, and then subsequent readings of that, and that kind of informs some of the drawings and studies and sketches that are a part of the project. I wouldn't say I was a good writer by my kind of by my natural instincts. I mean, I do enjoy writing about process of drawing, but writing as the first point of research is something that I'm still playing with, still toying with. But it's definitely, when you look at pieces of text that were written, 70 years ago, and then you read them back, and you suddenly realize how your perspective was specific at that point, and even just like kind of catalogs, even just very straightforward statements of things that I've noticed. They record not just your own kind of perspective, but they also record different aspects. So obviously the 3 different times of the year that I went to Japan. I've been to Japan in spring, autumn, and summer, and your relationship to the heat of the floor, for example, So for the last time I went was summer, and basically I was chasing the space in the temple to be in the shade because it was just so hot when you're like sat out in the sun that it was unbearable, and that obviously changes how you relate to the space. So those recorded pieces of my own texts and observations relate, I guess, to this idea of dream and imagination and how we think about place and how we and that's part of what my project is about. It's like Kyoto as a place is a real place, but it's also a place that exists in images and our imagination and our diaries. And I think that's it all relates to each other. It's about how they are communicated. But I'm not an expert on writing, so I'm still working on that.
I love that description, and like how the writing informs the drawing. I'm an anthropologist, so for me, my writing is informed by my drawing. So it's slightly the other way around. But this idea that writing in itself is a research process and is part of the analysis and all of that. Something else I thought was really interesting that you described, and really beautiful, how those paintings are made on the basis of other paintings. So not necessarily of like, okay, somebody was sitting, I don't know, somewhere and actually observing, I don't know, I don't like to use that word, but the reality, but was actually basing it on top of another painting. And or I think that's very close to also storytelling and writing in that sense. Like a lot of stories they by nature are based on somebody else's telling of the story and kind of move on through that. And I think it draws out beautifully this I don't know, my students often are also sometimes in lectures it's like, oh, but what, you need to document the fact, or what is real. And I think your work really beautifully points out this ephemeral quality of what is of perception, of experience, of reality, and these and there this relationship between text and drawing, between kind of like what follows on to the other, is really beautiful. Thank you. Lovely talk.
I think that's I always have this reference that I speak about when it comes to this, which is this idea of like how people remember things differently to how they were. So people, like the thing I talk about is quotes from films. So people often, if you think about Snow White, for example, people think that the quote is mirror, mirror on the wall, whereas that the actual film, which I haven't seen in decades, is magic mirror on the wall. And it doesn't matter that that's what the actual quote is. People think mirror, mirror on the wall. And that becomes in and of itself just as important as the actual quote. So it's about these myths that we generate for ourselves based on memory, but also popular cultural identity. And so these paintings of place were more, impactful in the cultural imagination, the collective imagination of place, than the actual building itself, which only a limited number of people would have gone to at the time.
And then that hold also a lot of power, as you talked about right at the beginning of your talk. Like that's the idea of this place held in the drawing, being constantly reproduced. Of this is what Kyoto is in a way. No,
exactly.
Beautiful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nara, for just taking the talk to such a beautiful place. I'd like to ask if anyone else has any questions right now. Rupali, yeah, of course. Yeah, Joel, could you make Rupali join the chat?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sayan, for this beautiful talk. And I just want to, I have a question about your reworking of this the 16th century painting, the 17th century painting here. And in some ways, you began with saying that the way this painting was done itself was from artists mimicking other artists, right? And then sort of producing this. So there's a kind of almost this kind of process of quotations, right? Like
Yeah.
you're quoting somebody, and then you kind of, and so in some ways your process also continues this method of quotations.
Yes.
But in some ways, what happens now in this painting is there's a new kind of density that you see, right? Like in the original painting, what is obscured is probably not the sacred but the profane, right? Like you wouldn't have a gold cloud on the temple, right?
Yeah.
But in some ways, what you start revealing is this other city, the messy city, the city of density. And I heard you say that you made this, you did that drawing before you went to Kyoto. And then there was the photogrammetry and all of that, and that sort of got built in other forms of the drawing. But I'm just wondering if you were really in that density and that messiness. Were you speculating on what that the city would have been then, or were you in some ways trying to bring in some ideas of that the messiness of the contemporary city? Was there something about like how you add on today to the drawing?
Yeah, I guess the contemporary city is probably more present in the scans, because and that is again because it predates my actual experience of the actual city. So I think in very much my PhD kind of tries to frame who I am as an author of the research, because I'm very much an outsider. I'm a foreigner. I have a Western gaze, even though I have obviously South Asian roots, but my gaze is still Westernized. But then these paintings were produced by insiders for outsiders. So they were almost trying to pitch the city for the external gaze. And that culture has continued. Like people, there's a lot about what I write about in my third chapter, which is about how we imagine Kyoto today, and how this selective vision of Kyoto, which dates back, you're right, 17th century, but the original ones were 16th century. So this has been going on for centuries, where ideas of place has been about editing out and bringing certain things to the fore. The drawing process, the kind of is a mixture of me trying in some ways to faithfully finish the painting, but also disrupt that as much as possible, and is an idiosyncratic process. So if someone else was charged with the same task, their drawing would be different. It's not I'm not suggesting that my drawing is a kind of objective and faithful completion of the city. It's a possible, it's a version of the city that could exist or could be represented in alignment with the original painting, but in many ways is absurd in its own language, because it's drawing upon my own authorship. So it's a quote. It's trying to. I love your word quotation. That's a good word for describing that. I also use the word revision as like, a drawing revision, when you go through several revisions or something. And I see myself as a co-author of the painting, where my drawing is reliant on the existing painting. It's fundamentally reliant on it. But it's also my own drawing that I have introduced my own agenda and my own intuitive process to fill and flesh out. So it's not meant to be interpreted as a faithful or objective completion of the painting, but it's meant to both be kind of, just have this relationship to it that is so distinct, that it could be interpreted as a completion, but is also essentially me learning the painting. So I learn how, let's do the scroll through the thing. I learn how the language of, and again, because it's before I've been there, I learn the language of the city in a certain way, that there's these language of shutters and doors and the idea of the machia housing having this kind of really patterned facade of not big windows like we have in the West, but kind of screens and planes and a kind of three-dimensional facade. And so the language of the painting and the language of the eaves that kind of extend over the architecture of the spaces and the kind of the roofscape that feeds into my language as I'm learning how the architecture of the painting is being portrayed, not through a literal reconstruction of it, but through a kind of a process of picking up on these motifs. So the mashrabiyah, the balconies, the fragmented elements of screens and meshes, and this language of architecture that is so prevalent in the painting becomes a kind of motif that I twist and play with.
Yeah, I actually like your term revision, and I'm almost wondering what this maybe a new revision of this drawing would be now that you've visited Tokyo. Kyoto, and would because I'm also reminded of some of the contemporary indigenous artists in South Asia who now also start drawing things from their own contemporary lives.
Yeah.
No, so it's not like these are fixed in time, that if I'm from a tribal village, I'm going to just draw those particular motifs, but the tribal village is as much in transformation. It's as contemporary as anything else, and so you start seeing these kind of new motifs of contemporary life starting to unfold. So I'm just wondering if some of that revision would be something that you would be willing to think about, or is it really a kind of a faithful reproduction of that image? I mean, what is it that you would bring in beyond what your interpretation of that, what is obscured by the gold cloud would be?
I think that's I think what your I think your observation of the temporal distinction between the two, I think I try to address, but obviously I've changed area of focus in these studies. But the people, what I engage with here is the tourist gaze, in the way that the people here, if you can see, are contemporary. There's another. I didn't have a detail of it, but I have this idea of tourist gaze of how certain things are captured in today's city that are distinct, like the predominant tourist occupation of Kyoto, and the way in which like spaces of tranquility are like now completely different because of the density of people that are visiting it, and also the selective experience of the city, so the kind of clustering at certain key locations. That is a conversation that is to do with the contemporary Kyoto and my experience of Kyoto, and trying to use some of the language of the original paintings in terms of the way in which it was constructed as a way of generating a new urban version of the paintings without literally inhabiting the actual painting like my first study did. I think it's an interesting thing to kind of maybe combine both approaches, where the fabric of the painting is revised for because the figures of these original paintings are obviously taken from the original setting. It could be an interesting thing to kind of layer the historic and the contemporary city as a kind of as a way of shifting temporal gazes more directly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rupali. And I just have one last question. I was just wondering, Ki, as what do you draw from your practice as an architect, artist that might become, some kind of an anchor or some kind of coordinates for a pedagogy of drawing in your studios
Hmm.
as
Well,
a teacher?
there's different things. My teaching and my studios focus on the use of. This specific project, the paintings in Kyoto are. Even in my PhD is a case study. It's an example of what drawing can do. And what I try and do with my students is to ask them to use drawing not just a means of showing me what you know, but as a vehicle for progressing the project. So whether it's the process of designing the architecture, whether it's through conventions of plan or section or whatever it is, use the drawing as a tool to progress the architecture. And for example, a lot of students now want to go straight into a digital model of a building and then produce some beautiful drawings after the fact, which can lead to some really exciting, designs and stuff, but doesn't necessarily use the convention of drawing to tell you anything or to progress the design. So I often ask students to think about projects through the drawing and inhabit them and revise them in many ways. So tracing is important. Tracing is important in my research, in my engagement of how I draw. Like that, it's very much about putting something over something and re-inhabiting it, but changing something slightly and reinterpreting it. So I often ask students to kind of redraw things that they've drawn before and change and alter that. But then also the kind of representation of place is a big part of my project, part of my teaching. So how people develop tools of mapping and recording time in place. So my teaching draws from my research more thematically on what I'm interested in these paintings, rather than the kind of specific language of drawing that I use. I don't think my job as a teacher is to tell students how to design or what type of architecture to design, but it is
Or
to
even how to
introduce.
draw, actually, I'm sure.
Yeah, and because these are very personal things, like what kind of I've said they're idiosyncratic, they're unique to how I see the space or the paintings, and if everyone else did the same thing, they would come up with something different, and that's the beauty of it. But the approach or the kind of the lens of inquiring, the kind of the inquisitivity and the idea of understanding time, understanding identity, understanding conventions of drawing, understanding how we represent place. I think those are things that students can really get to grips with and still develop their own design language, their own architectural language. That is, and I think it's about making sure that whatever they design, whether it's one style of architecture or the other, but it still come from a rigorous process, from kind of an understanding of these themes and the rigor of drawing, which is about thinking, really, I think, as well, as much as representation.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Sayan. I just wanted to say it's been so nice of you to join us and be so generous and share your work over here. And I think we've all just been able to think about, the many roles of the architectural drawing and its capacity as, of course, a design accomplice, like you just outlined in this last bit, but also through your own works, the way in which it gives you an opportunity to just wonder and wonder without any outcome, and mostly to speculate on alternative agendas for space making and space thinking primarily. So thanks for that, and we really look forward to seeing your work in the future, and looking forward to the second part of the cartographies of imagination.
Yes,
So
yeah, no, yeah, I think we're on Instagram, Cartographies of the Imagination. We haven't really posted anything for a while, but if we do if we do move ahead with that, there'll be announcements on that. So hopefully that does happen. Yeah, and thank you so much again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. And we'll close the talk now, and we'll meet for the next talk on the 27th of September. We have a bit of a break in between, and we'll be speaking with Parismita Singh, who is an artist and author, and she's written a few graphic novels, and she's also a teacher as well. So it'll be nice to see what, her take on narratives and drawing is. So thank you so much once again. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Sayan.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.